Pink with Runaway. Welcome back. It is the Country Viewpoint here on your colour of Country Life Flow FM, and it's time to touch on a topic that we haven't explored a whole lot of on the program this year. We're talking about public schools and government schools and how they're funded and a number of issues that are going on. And joining me on the line is the Curtin University School of Education lecturer, Dr. Matthew Sinclair, to tell us more about it all. Great to be with you, Matthew. How are you?
Yeah, going well for a Friday. What about yourself?
Yeah, doing quite well indeed. And we do appreciate your time. Well, firstly, just bring us in on how this all works, because I've always wondered why it is the case that private schools might be funded in a better way than government schools are when, private schools are getting extensive tuition fees that government schools are not getting most of the time. So firstly, why is that?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a topical and political issue, school funding, particularly of private schools, for decades in Australia. So it's not a new debate. And one of the major reasons, I guess, there's several, but I guess one of the major reasons is a cultural debate, I would say, around the debate between entitlement and need. In school funding in particular, we talk about and we debate whether schools are entitled to funding or should we fund schools based on need. And often the non-government schools representatives will argue, due to paying taxes, etc., that they're entitled to a piece of the funding pie. And on the other hand, there would be advocates for public schooling who would say, based on the inequalities and the inequities, we need to fund schools based on need. Public schools or government schools need additional support, therefore they need extra funding, much more than many of the private schools. And it does come back to how the schools are also funded at the different levels of government, if you'd like me to go into the specifics of that.
By all means. Yeah, tell us more.
Yeah, I mean, so we had the Gonski Review in 2011, which I'm sure probably your listeners are familiar with, and it suggested a student resource standard to fund Australian schools consistently. So to provide a base amount for every individual student plus loadings for disadvantage. And one of the key debates that's happening at the moment is public schools aren't receiving 100% of the student resource standard, and non-government schools are receiving 100% of that student resource standard. And the reason for that is the federal government provide 80% of the resource standard for non-government schools, and the states kick in 20%. Whereas with public schools, the states kick in 80%, or are supposed to kick in 80% the student resource standard, and the federal government kick in 20%. And what's happening is the states and territories in every state and territory in Australia, except the ACT, aren't funding 80% of the student resource standard. So public schools are being funded at less than 100%. Due to the states and territories not holding up, I guess, to their 80%, which is resulting in underfunding.
And what are the consequences of that underfunding as far as, the typical kind of outcome that you're seeing or people on the ground are saying? Is it, just resources in the classroom or teaching staff? What is the bottom line that's being most impacted? Yeah,
it's all of those things. I mean, particularly in a rural and regional context. There was a review that came out in February of this year which looked at the resourcing of rural and regional schools, and what they found is that compared to metro schools, that it is more difficult to keep staff. Often schools are smaller, so you don't get the economies of scale in terms of the number of students and decreasing costs as the student numbers go up. Also, there's issues around the curriculum and what's being able to be offered. And the fact that, I guess, public schools aren't being funded at 100% of the resource standard, particularly in regional and rural contexts, really means that they're at a disadvantage to start with, let alone not being funded at 100% of the SRS. So, there's a number of ways that plays out. So, certainly something that needs to be addressed, I would say.
I'm glad you went to the regional and rural landscape because it just seems as though one could definitely make the argument that, clearly families in a lot of parts of the Australian outback are being fairly disadvantaged. Obviously, in some regional centres, you might get the option of being able to send your kid to a private school, but a lot of the time in rural areas, they do not exist.
Yeah, that's one of the things that the review into the resourcing of regional, rural and remote schools did find. Choice is something that is popular, particularly in metropolitan Australia, and in many contexts that you mentioned, that just doesn't exist. And also one of the things around the student resource standard and the money that regional and rural schools do receive, that's an estimate of what they need. And what this review found was that the costs of regional, rural and remote schooling are much, much higher. And also some of the challenges that we mentioned before. So funding, particularly in that regional, rural and remote context, is quite challenging. And I think there needs to be further work done there, I would say.
Curtin University Expert and the School of Education lecturer, Dr. Matthew Sinclair, speaking to me there. We'll continue this conversation with him on the other side of the break. It's a very important one, so don't miss it. I'll see you back here real soon. Kelly Clarkson with Merry Christmas, Baby, and welcome back. It is the third hour of the Tuesday edition of the Country Viewpoint on Flow FM. I'm speaking to the Curtin University School of Education lecturer, Dr. Matthew Sinclair, who says it's time for action, not rhetoric, on public school funding. Now, Matthew, I guess another cause for concern that a lot of parents might have out there who are listening to this is the fact that, in a marriage where we've got all this news that's constantly being outlaid about the performance dwindling of kids in school in Australia compared to where it has been in the past. Obviously, that given that there's also a lack of funding all the way through the public system in many contexts, that would certainly trouble some people.
Yeah, and I mean, it's one thing, I was discussing this earlier in the week around the need for this to be, I think, a political issue and voters to really, I guess, vote with their feet around this. We do have the Australian Labor Party in government at the federal level and in all states and territories in Australia except Tasmania, who arguably have been the representatives of public education in particular throughout Australia's history, yet we still don't have schools at 100% of the SRS. And as you mentioned, since the year 2000, Australian students' performance has continued to drop. So we do have the National School Reform Agreement negotiations happening at the moment, which is an agreement between the Commonwealth or the federal government and the Australian states around how funding should be spent and what the targets are. So I'm sure those things are being discussed. But I think, yes, the funding of public schools, particularly getting them to 100% of that SRS, needs to happen as soon as possible.
No doubt. Well, whilst we still have you on the air, we'll just ask you the final question with a positive spin on it. What is going well in the Australian school system right now? Yeah,
I mean, there are some positives, and I think it is quite easy to focus on the things that aren't going well. I think we should spend time focusing on those. But a couple of weeks ago, the OECD released the Program for International Student Assessment results, which tests students around the world aged 15 years old in maths, science and literacy. And Australia is performing above the OECD average in PISA across those three domains. And we are now in the top 10 countries around the world in those three areas. Largely in 2022 bout of testing, that was because other countries had, fallen quite significantly in their performance. But nonetheless, Australia was in the top 10 across those domains, which I think is good news. Also, more students in Australia are finishing school, particularly since the Gonski report in 2011. I think we've had roughly a 10% increase in the amount of students that are finishing school. So there are some positives there. It's not all, I guess, doom and gloom, but I think it just speaks to public schools in particular. Australia performing in the top 10. Imagine what they could do with I guess, full funding of that SRS.
And Dr. Matthew Sinclair, just before I do let you go, a question without notice. Bronwyn Bishop, former Speaker of the Australian House of Representatives, recently called for scrapping the national curriculum, and she basically argued that the reason for that should be that if there's no roadmap that every state has to follow with, what is taught in our schools today, then one of them will get it right, in her opinion at least. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the I guess, the intricacies and complexities of some of the funding issues that we've discussed today is that Australia is a federation and the states and territories run their respective education systems. and schools are funded. The states distribute the funding and they're responsible for running schools. And as much as the federal government does provide significant funding, does set the national curriculum, at the end of the day, the states are responsible for running schools. And I think, the challenges and the histories and the cultures of the different states and territories can be quite different, and I guess their approaches and their needs are quite different. So, one of the ongoing debates is, do we need a national curriculum given the federation and the histories and cultures of the respective states? Well, what would be my answer to that? I think it's useful to have national goals and, national areas of focus. But by the same token, I do think that we need curriculum that reflects, local and state-based cultures and needs. So, what would I suggest in response to Bronwyn Bishop's point? I think it's something worth exploring. But I think, the realities of the amount of money that the federal government are putting into education, I don't think they're going to back off a national curriculum anytime soon.
Certainly a very intricate subject. Well, that's where we'll leave it. Dr. Matthew Sinclair, the Curtin University School of Education lecturer, it's been a privilege to get your insights on all these issues, and we really do appreciate your time. All the very best with everything.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Dr. Matthew Sinclair, Curtin University's School of Education lecturer, rounding things out for us on a Tuesday on the Country Viewpoint for 2023. We're going to wrap the show up after this break. I'll see you back here soon.